This is Steve Smith, Director of the VLab, and I'm joined here in the VLabForum Studios in beautiful downtown Silver Spring, Maryland, in the shadow of the giant acorn. Welcoming everyone for, I guess this would be our Dog Days edition of the VLabForum in August here. Hope everybody's summer is going well. This afternoon, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jeanette Sutton of the Risk and Disaster Communication Center at the University of Kentucky, I believe, who's going to be presenting a talk entitled Build Community Before the Storm, Social Media Engagement for Crisis Communication. We have been attempting in the VLabForum in terms of providing talks relative to weather service operations to diversify and have more talks along the lines of social science and IDSS related research. Today's talk by Dr. Sutton is furthering that goal as Weather Service continues to execute its paradigm shift to doing more IDSS in a more robust, comprehensive way. We are looking to the R&D community to help us in those endeavors. A reminder to everyone, our format is approximately 30 minutes of content that Dr. Sutton will present, and then we have a Q&A session for the remainder of the hour. We ask that you, when we turned to the Q&A session, to use the raise your hand feature of the GoToWebinar to raise your hand. And John Chattel, our logistics manager of the VLabForum, will unmute you so you can ask your question to Dr. Sutton directly. You can also use the chat feature to type in a question, in which case we will relay it to Dr. Sutton on your behalf. Another reminder is that these sessions are recorded, and we will be uploading the recording to the VLabForum website shortly after the conclusion of today's session. So without further ado, Dr. Sutton, are you there?
I am here.
Very good. You're coming in loud and clear. So I'm going to hand over the GoToWebinar, and you are in control. Go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to present today. I'm really happy to be able to share with you some work that we've been doing out of my research group, which is in collaboration with UC Irvine, where we've been looking at the ways that social media is used by public safety organizations. And more recently, over the last year or so, we've been focusing primarily on National Weather Service organizations. So in particular, we have collected, since the National Weather Service began using Twitter, we have collected all of the tweets that have gone out from all of the different NWS handles. And so what I'm presenting on today is just a very small portion of that data, with the intent over the next year, with some additional funding, to actually look at the full data set and to answer some questions about how the use of social media actually increases follower numbers and increases the distribution of information across the network. But that's a different question from what I'm going to be looking at today. So this is my plan for my talk today, is to talk about how the strategic use of social media is a best practice for crisis communication. And what I think of crisis communication, I actually think that what you do as NWS employees who use social media on a daily basis, you're actually practicing crisis communication. It's just that you're not always in crisis. You're constantly providing information into the social media network information sphere, and that information is a longitudinal campaign where there's periods of crisis, but the ongoing engagement is actually really important. So we're going to talk about that. And I'm also going to talk about the use of social media by 12 different National Weather Service offices, which I'll show you which ones and when we collected that data. And we're going to talk a little bit about how social media use has differed by those 12 different offices by time, in terms of whether or not an office is engaged in threat communication or non-threat communication. And then I'm going to offer some thoughts about what this means for engagement efforts over time for other offices also. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about goals, tactics, and strategies. And I believe it was last week that there was a presentation that was shared through the AMS as well as through risk analysis by John Besley. And he talked about goals and tactics and strategies for risk communication. And he outlined it saying that the goal is what you want to accomplish. The tactic is what mechanism you're going to use, and the strategy is what can you do or say to accomplish the goal. And as I was looking at a recent publication that's in Weather, Climate, and Society by Kathleen Sherman Morris out of Mississippi, some of you may have seen this, it was asking the question of what is it that the National Weather Service warning coordination meteorologists want from social scientists. What's your actual goal that you're trying to achieve? And if social scientists could help you to achieve that goal, how would they do so? And so what people said in that article that Dr. Sherman Morris published was warning coordination meteorologists really want to know how to change people's behavior in a disaster or in a crisis situation. They want to know what's the magic words, the magic phrasing of messages to actually get people to do what you want them to do in a time of crisis. And whether that's evacuating, sheltering in place, turning around when flooded instead of driving through roadways, and the other kinds of messages that go out. Dr. Besley talked about achieving these goals by using different tactics, channels, and different strategies. And in the case of what I'm going to talk about today, the tactic, the channel is looking at Twitter in particular, and the strategy is what can I do or say to affect the goal on Twitter? Now, importantly, because we're looking at this as a strategic aspect of changing the goal, I'm not actually going to be talking about the messaging themselves. I'm going to be talking about how you can use that channel over time to influence behavioral change. And we're talking specifically about something called engagement. And engagement is about shaping beliefs through communication efforts and strategies. Oftentimes, you hear about engagement in terms of very simply defined measures of dialogue, especially when you're talking about social media, that in order to achieve the ultimate in engagement, what you want to do is have this back and forth of messages that are directed to individuals. But engagement is more than just that individualized dialogue. It's about this ongoing communication effort. And we know that things that will influence the goal of getting people to take action when you need them to take action is actually demonstrating through this engagement that you are caring and honest, that you listen and are open, that you are similar to the people who are looking for information or need information, and that you are competent. Because demonstrating these different things through engagement, it increases the likelihood that message receivers will act on the message when they actually receive them. Because over time, you've laid this groundwork, this foundation for increasing people's willingness to trust and believe and act on the information that you're providing, because over time you've demonstrated that you're caring and honest, that you're listening to people as they're sharing information, or others are sharing information in the community, demonstrating some similarities between concerns, and absolutely demonstrating competency. So I'm part of a team called HEROIC, which stands for Hazards, Emergency Response, and Online Informal Communication with UC Irvine. We've been studying social media communication since 2009, looking at Twitter. And right now, our two primary research questions are these. What are the engagement strategies used by NWS offices on Twitter, and how do these strategies differ between non-threat and threat periods? Here's my colleague, Carter Butts. He and I have been working together for almost a decade now, and a couple of our graduate students. I want to definitely call attention to Mickey Olson, who's going to be moving to Maryland in a few weeks, and she's going to be joining the social science team in Maryland, and we're very excited for her work and opportunity to take what we've been doing into the NOAA offices there. So here are the accounts that we collected, and you see that they're fairly spread out across the United States, with the exception of Norman and Dallas-Fort Worth, which are right next to each other. And they represent different potential threats, different areas, different geographical areas, different kinds of communities, rural versus urban, southern versus eastern versus Pacific Northwest. We include Alaska and Hawaii as part of that. And we collected during the spring months of April through June, thinking that we would get tweets that were being sent out for threats that might include things about end of spring, blizzard kind of conditions, tornadoes starting to start up, maybe some flash flooding and thunderstorms, and Hawaii and Alaska could always be at risk for a tsunami. And so you see that there's a great deal of variation between the number of tweets that were sent out by each office, with Norman, Oklahoma being the clear leader in the number of tweets that go out, and Hawaii being pretty far down the list in the numbers that they've actually sent out. And then we also collected all of the products that come out of your offices through, I can't remember the name of the group that actually houses all of the data at this moment. It's, I believe it's Iowa. There's a program there. If somebody types it into the chat box, they'll say, yes, you're absolutely right. And we collected all of the products that include the advisories, watches, warnings, statements, forecast products. And then we matched all of those products to the times at which tweets went out, so that we could tell whether or not an individual office was actually tweeting during a threat period where there's an active product that's out, either a watch or a warning, or no active threat that's actually being observed at the time. And then we took all of these tweets that we had collected, about a little over 10,000, close to 11,000 tweets, and we coded for two different kinds of things for engagement. We started by looking at the content that's shared in each tweet, and the contents fall into three different categories: information, community, and action, and I'll talk about these in just a moment. And you see that the content in particular is what's circled in the red at the top of the tweet. We didn't look at the images themselves, but we did note whether or not an image was attached to the tweet. And then we also looked at that technological features that are part of the social channel, and we call these things microstructures. So if it includes a hashtag, if it includes a directed message with a little @ symbol, if it includes a visual that's attached to to the tweet itself, if it includes a URL that's attached so that people could click it and then go out to additional sources of information. And so we code all of these tweets for these things. So here we had 4 different kinds of information content categories. So here you see that we coded for forecast tweets, which it's talking about weather in the future. Nowcast tweets, so that things are current and ongoing. And again, you see that I circled for you in red the things that we were looking at as we looked at the content of these different tweets that were created by all of the 12 offices. We also looked at something called weather facts, where offices are talking about historical weather data, or what we would consider fun facts, like looking back at 8 years ago today, NWS Jackson had something about a historical tornado that hit Wayne County. And then weather products are the products, the language that is similar to what comes out of the products that the National Weather Service issues. A lot of times they are things that are driven by a bot, like the one that you see here from NWS Miami, where this is very obviously a bot created tweet. It wasn't written by somebody sitting at their keyboard at the time that an event is actually going on. On the left, under weather facts, you also see that I highlighted it with the blue circle, the URL, and that's what I mean by a kind of microstructure. And then two more kinds of engagement content categories we looked for were community and action. Now, action are messages that tell people to do something. When we first thought about action, we tried to put things into categories of preparedness actions or response actions. They didn't fall very easily into those categories, and so instead we just look at action, and then when we look at whether or not you're actually tweeting during a threat period, we could say it's more about action during the threat, and in the pre-threat period, it's more about actions about preparing to take action. And community messages are messages that are about classes at the local weather forecast office, volunteering, local office information, asking people to share information. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to engage in sharing information or engage in doing these activities that are offered by the local office, but it's something that the local office is talking about. And I also circle under community in blue the exclamation point, because we code for sentence structure style in addition to these other microstructure issues or features. So here are the features that we coded for. Not all of them were present in those tweets that I shared with you. But we look at directed messages, which is the @ username. We look for web links. We don't actually code the contents of what's in those web links. We just look for whether or not they're present or absent. We look at whether or not an account is mentioning other accounts, which is an indicator that an office is paying attention to what other people are saying as they're monitoring Twitter. We include the code RT, which means retweet, whether or not there are hashtags and the kinds of hashtags that are included, attachments of media, and then again, sentence style. And then we match the products to the timing of tweets from each NWS weather office. Now, I had some conversations back in March with people at Silver Spring about why we chose to only include an active watcher warning. Why not a statement or an advisory? And this is under some discussion with our future research, where we can look at things a little bit more refined, and we can look at whether or not there are some differences during advisory periods versus statement periods versus watches versus warnings. We'll go ahead and look at those things in greater detail, but for right now, we're only looking at threat as being under active watch and warning. All right, so here's what the data looks like. So thunderstorm was the most frequent hazard for which products were issued. This probably makes a great deal of sense, especially given that those central U.S. counties in Oklahoma and Texas, Kentucky, Colorado were all, spring season. A lot of thunderstorms come up. And then these other ones you see represent the diversity of kinds of threats that are being addressed. And then if you look here, what we've done is highlighted how many tweets had these different kinds of content categories and the microstructure categories. And on the far left, information is by far the highest. Information, remember, includes those first four categories of nowcast, forecast, facts, or product. And so if you combine those four smaller categories together, it should be equal to or greater than the information category that's there. But within that, the forecast category is by far the highest, followed by nowcast. And that makes a great deal of sense, because the task of the National Weather Service is to provide information to people to make decisions about protective actions or about their day, about how they're going to go about their day based upon the current conditions. And so it makes perfect sense that those would be the highest tweeted content categories. And this was followed by community, where there's been a good deal of attention from some offices at building community by building awareness of what the organization is doing at the local office level. Fewer product tweets, which would correspond with products that are active, the watches and the warnings, and then even fewer action tweets, but not by much. Now, when you look over to the blue bars, you'll see that media and hashtag are very high. More than 50% of the tweets that we looked at included a hashtag, which basically takes a tweet and puts it into a channel of information so that people can find it. Especially during breaking events if you're using the hashtag of that particular threat. Right now in California, there's the Holy Fire that's got a lot of hashtags around that, and the other fire events. And so by participating in that hashtag communication, people who are not followers of your individual account can actually find your tweets. And then more than half include media. So at the beginning of the talk, I said that the people often think of engagement as the optimum engagement is going to be replies, that directed message back and forth between the office and an individual user is the ultimate in engagement. Well, I don't actually agree with that assessment, that that's the ultimate in engagement. However, if you see the number of replies here, about 1/5 of the tweets that have been sent out include a reply. So it demonstrates that there is a good amount of that dialogic engagement that is actually taking place. And the mentions are over 3,000 of our 10,000 tweets. So a lot of the offices are paying attention to what other offices are actually saying or other individuals in the Twitter sphere are actually saying and giving them credit in their tweets that are going out. So when we look at this by time, we actually start to see some differences. The way that you read this particular graph is you look for the dotted line that's on the right-hand side of your screen between question and forecast. And that's where you start to see a difference between an increased prevalence in some kinds of contents and some kinds of microstructure, and a decreased prevalence in some kinds of contents and some kinds of structure. So on the left-hand side of the dotted line and the decreased prevalence, you see that the arrow is moving downward from the non-warning period to the warning period, which says that during that time, that the contents or the microstructures are decreasing in prevalence in the warning period. So during a warning period, look at URL on the far left side. In contrast with the non-warning period, there is a significant decline in the number of tweets that include a URL. And if you go to directly to the right of that, under community, you also see a decline there, a significant decline from the number of tweets that include community engagement content from a non-warning period to a warning period. It declines. This makes a great deal of sense because the strategies of the activity of building community during over time is better done during a non-threat period when people are not worrying about the threat. Now, if you go to the right of that dotted line, you'll see an increased prevalence, and the greatest number of content-driven messages increases in the product category. And information is off the chart because, again, remember that we have 4 different categories of information, and that information just sweeps them all up into one category. But you also find an interesting thing in that replies, where replies actually has an increased prevalence during the threat period, which I think is very interesting. So I'm going to go through this really quickly so we can get to some questions. And just to highlight some of those things I've already mentioned, that community messages go down, community-based engagement goes down during the warning period. Instruction and action goes down during the warning period. These informational tweets, forecast, nowcast, and product increases. Weather facts goes down, which makes a great deal of sense because I think of those as being very similar to the community building kinds of tweets in terms of the content. It's sharing information just to help people to understand a little bit more about the weather service. And then when you look at all of these red highlighted boxes are looking at the microstructure features, and most of them decrease in prevalence with the exception of the replies. And we saw in particular one office that did a lot of replying during threat periods, and that was out of Norman, Oklahoma. And there appears that some offices are spending a great deal of time actually being actively engaged with individual users and responding directly to their questions. we don't have the ability to see which questions are coming into each office because of the way that our data collection system works. We're only looking at the messages that are going out from an office. So we don't know how many questions were coming in that were not being replied to, but we do see that across all 12 organizations, there is an increase in replies. Sentence structure also differs a little bit by time. The number of exclamations goes down, the number of questions. Questions tend to be kind of pretty rhetorical, really, as sort of a way of getting people to think about things. But sometimes there's questions that are asked, such as, will you send us a picture of something that you've seen, like if you found hail on the ground in your community, can you send us a picture of the hail, or of downed trees, or of flooded roads, that kind of thing, when people are out of danger. Okay, so putting this into practice. Engagement is really, it's a longitudinal strategy. It's not just about communicating during times of crisis. Crisis communication actually occurs over time, so that when a threat actually appears, people have developed a rapport in terms of their expectations being met, that the organization they're following or they're looking to is competent, can share information that's relevant, that they're trustworthy, that they're paying attention and listening, and that they care about their community. And so when the threat period comes, they're more likely to trust that information, which will lead to the ultimate goal that weather forecast offices have said, which is to get people to take action when they're being told to take action. So when there's no threat, offices are focusing on fostering community. They're also sharing forecasts, but this is also the time to talk about historical events, to provide science education, to personalize perceptions of the office, to encourage preparedness action through education. And then during the threat periods, offices are providing relevant information, and they're replying to questions if possible. We weren't providing an evaluation of what was happening in those 12 different offices, but we certainly found some really exceptional practices of offices utilizing Twitter in a way that they're doing this ongoing engagement by putting a lot of different kinds of content into the Twitter space for their followers, and also participating actively in conversations during threat periods by using the threat period hashtag, and also having direct communication with individuals during threat. And here's my point about engagement as interaction. If we think of engagement as being only about those directed messages, then we're failing to see that information plays a role in community building and leading to action. Because engagement is really at the bottom, it's a foundational level for a hierarchy of messages. That information is one of the things that the public expects from the National Weather Service, and it provides them with exactly what they need in a time of trust and to increase future interaction, and it helps to build a community of followers. And when we look at social media microstructures, we see that the use of hashtags is actively being utilized by at least half of those tweets. A lot of times during an active event, because that helps people to find the information. So that's a wonderful practice that I encourage offices to continue to do. More than half of the tweets include media, and media is important because we know that information during the time we were looking at this particular set of tweets, this is when tweets were limited to 140 characters. And so adding that media helped to give additional information that couldn't be expressed beyond the 140 characters. And then we also see that a lot of mentions and directed messages that showed the offices are actively monitoring and responding to people during threat periods, as well as during non-threat periods. So just to kind of wrap up, I want to go back to the goal, because I think this actually raises some important questions about what the goal could be about changing people's behavior. If if the goal is about change in behavior using Twitter as a tactic, and the strategy is what can I say or do to affect my goal of changing behavior, that's very, very narrow. But engagement is more than about just changing behavior, because it's possible that maybe we're thinking too narrowly, that maybe that engagement and that the ultimate goal should not be about only persuading people to take action. Because there's other things that matter also from a social science perspective. And that's things like the reach of messages disseminated across a network, where we can look at what kinds of messages go farther. And when messages go farther, then there's more people who are exposed to those messages, which and it also means that those messages might be retweeted, which the more often you see the same message over and over again, the more likely you are to believe it. And we can also increase the exposure of people to information, increase their awareness of what's happening, which is a precursor to decision making. Other things that matter are increasing information seeking and sharing, which is not always the thing that we want people to be doing, especially during periods of imminent threat. We actually want people to take action. However, it demonstrates their interaction and engagement with the information that's being provided. And perhaps that's an outcome that you want people to engage in when they have longer periods of time, several hours leading up to needing to take action, that you actually want them to look for information so they can be informed with their decision making. And social media engagement can reduce uncertainty. It can increase knowledge and understanding. Importantly, it can help to maintain or increase the credibility of the National Weather Service as a source of information, which is that longitudinal ongoing strategy becomes really important, this ongoing demonstration of credibility. And also, other things that matter are aligning risk perceptions with actual risk, so that people can have a better sense of whether or not they truly are at risk, and understanding the risk as well. Increasing self-efficacy, meaning increasing the belief that I can actually take an action that will lead me to safety, whether through preparedness or during the time of threat. And the bottom line is changing behavior when it's absolutely necessary. But all these other things that are listed here are part of this overall picture of what engagement can actually do, which can ultimately influence that behavioral change. So these things can be accomplished through ongoing communication, and they're precursors to persuasion, which I understand is the ultimate goal. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. And I hope that you have some questions, and I'm happy to entertain those.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sutton, for that really insightful overview. And yes, we are now, we'll turn to our Q&A portion of the session. So if you would like to ask Dr. Sutton a question, please use the raise your hand feature, and John Chattel will unmute you. I'll start off with one, Dr. Sutton, is, did you talk about the engagement strategies or the Twitter strategy? So did you talk to these offices either before the study or after the study about whether they actually had a specific strategy that they decided upon and used in the course of these events, or are you assuming there's a strategy?
We did not speak to the offices. So when I use strategy, I use it as a framework for looking at Twitter as you can almost say that it's more like it's a model of engagement. It's not pointing out very specific things that those offices are doing intentionally. It's trying to identify what are the kinds of ways that these offices are utilizing that channel to achieve their ultimate goal, which would be helping people to make decisions during imminent threat, ideally, because that's one of the charges of the National Weather Service, is to put out that warning information in time of need. with the hope that it would lead people to safety. So no, we did not speak to individual offices to ask them about their individual strategies.
Okay, so sort of a follow-up question is, do you view that your study here of Twitter and the tweets is reflective of the general disposition of the office towards engagement, whether it's through Twitter or other social media or other means, or it's unique to the Twitter in that regard?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, I don't know what other kinds of channels these different offices are using, if they have additional outreach activities that they engage in on a daily basis. Or if, you know, some offices obviously have a more robust use of Twitter than other offices do, and that's evidenced through the number of tweets that are being shared and the different ways that those offices are using Twitter. And it may be that some offices are choosing not to use Twitter as robustly as other offices are, and we don't know why some of them might choose to do so and some of them might choose not to. I'm going to go a little bit beyond the question that you asked, because it might help to understand why we even did this study in the first place, given that we didn't go and talk to those offices and create some sort of analytical models about how this is actually effective or not effective. By starting with looking at engagement, we're intending to build models to actually do some prediction about how these strategies affect message diffusion across the network at the individual office level, as well as for different kinds of threats. So this was our first step towards coding all of the different kinds of contents and the styles of messages that will help us to build those models for the future.
Okay, thank you. John, do we have a question through the chat?
We do. I guess John Dumas wants to, he has a couple questions. The first is, any analysis of the audience receiving our tweets?
No, this is an unfortunate thing. And I say that because Twitter research is generally limited to the information that you can collect on Twitter itself. And in order to know how people are actually responding to individual tweets, we would have to do one of a few different strategies. We would either have to do a survey, going out and actually asking people if they remembered information that was being shared and what they did with that information or how they interpreted that information. Looking at individual dialogue between an office and an individual would lead us to having more insight that direction. A third way would be to look at the analytics that each office has access to see how many impressions they received on individual messages. We don't have access to any of that kind of data with the analyses that we are doing. So the modeling that we are intending to do next will give us some insight into what your audience is actually looking at when they are looking at tweets, because we'll be able to take these different categories that we've coded for and identify what things influence people passing those messages on. Those, we call those retweet models, and we've done them with other kinds of organizations and other kinds of threats to identify the characteristics of individual messages that influence people to pass them on during times of imminent threat. What we haven't been able to look at until now was what influences people's message passing during non-imminent threat times, which was one of the reasons we look at threat and non-threat. But we also will be able to look at follower growth numbers to see if there are different things that are occurring within the messaging itself that might influence increases in follower numbers, or if it's really just a function of the threat period itself drives follower numbers, which is usually what happens, is that when there's an active threat, you grow your numbers, and then people tend not to kind of prune their accounts, they just stay followers afterwards. that was a very long way of answering your question about audience research.
All righty, and then he followed that up with a second question, and that is, did you perform any analysis of the best times of the day to send tweets for reaching higher numbers of people or more timely periods of the day?
We have done that, and in fact, that should be coming in the next analysis that we're currently writing up. I believe we included the effects of time and day, and I don't have that information in front of me right now. During non-threat periods, there are times and days where it seems that people are paying more attention. And I don't want to give you any guesses because that would be misleading. But during threat periods, we know that when people are searching for information, they want to find it now, and they don't want to wait for it. When they wait for it, that is when people start to create their own answers to the questions that they're looking for information for. And so during threat periods, tweeting frequently updated information is the best strategy. During non-threat periods, we still have a little bit more analysis to do, but it's definitely among our analyses that we're working on.
Very good. And John Dumas says thanks to you in the chat window. So thanks, John, and thank you, Dr. Sutton, for the thoughtful replies. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand or the chat, and we can provide that question. I'll have another follow-up, I guess. It seems, you know, in a sense, I really appreciate your focus on engagement in this talk. And it's almost like you show through the use of the tweets that, you know, they're used to convey information, which is almost like an additional dissemination path in our parlance for our basic products and warnings. But the use of the Twitter and the tweets to demonstrate these things like caring and honest, do I listen, am I open? That's something that we can't easily do through our, you know, legacy products, so to speak. So it's almost like in that area is where touching upon this engagement that Twitter offers advantages that would pay off, as you say, in a strategy, a longitudinal strategy, because you're sort of prepping or priming the pump for better use of the information, better engagement, I guess is the term. So would you say that you would encourage, I mean, would you say that your results suggest that weather service forecast offices could benefit from attending to these non-threat periods and trying to convey that they're caring and honest and they're listening and et cetera through some of the non-threat periods would be an advantageous thing to do?
Absolutely. And that's a really great summary. I wish I had included that. If I didn't, I don't think I said it that way. That was a great way of saying it. Yes, the non-threat periods are just as important as threat periods. It's this idea that you're always performing crisis communication. It's just that only sometimes you're actually in that crisis period. But this longitudinal demonstration of being available by responding to people's questions, putting information out there that you're constantly trying to get people to pay attention to what you're saying by being present on a daily basis and showing that you're going to be consistently present. And you're right that this is a different kind of a conveyance or dissemination path for your information, because it's not coming out of a traditional product language where everything's in all caps and limited to 1,380 characters or however long it is now. You know, those kind of more traditional products, but some offices include a very personal touch to the kinds of information that they're sharing. We saw many times that people were saying it's going to be a beautiful day out there, enjoy the sunshine. Just these, I'm like you, I can relate to you. I'm encouraging you to live the best life that you can. Those are not things that you would find in a traditional product that's going out from the Weather Service, and it really offers an opportunity to meet people in a different way so that they see that you're human beings sitting behind a computer screen and not just some technology that's pushing out forecast information. So thank you. That was a very good summary for exactly what I would encourage, is being actively involved in communicating throughout. And I want to go back to when I first started doing research in this area of social media use. We started in 2008 by looking at some events that occurred in 2007. The earliest study we did was on the Southern California wildfires, which required the evacuation of most of San Diego through Riverside up to the Los Angeles area. Massive evacuations. And it was the emergence of Twitter, and there was a very quick pushback from agencies who said, we don't want to use this because people are just using it to talk about their cats, what their cats had for lunch or what they had for lunch. It's just a silly, childish thing. But the reluctance to be part of that channel and to develop a following is detrimental to an organization when there's a great desire for people who are under threat. And so already having that connection and that following before a threat occurs is of great benefit to you, because it becomes an opportunity to help to manage the conversation. And it's of great benefit to your individual followers who are looking for credible sources of information, because you've established yourself as being that credible, ongoing presence in this channel.
Very good. We have a question from, we have a couple questions. John, you want to relay those?
Sure. So Kevin Keller.
Kelleher.
Yes. Has asked, let's see.
Scroll up a bit. Scroll up.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Asks if any of your work in collaboration has been done in collaboration with the University of Oklahoma's Dr. Hank Jenkins Smith and Dr. Carol Silva, who have been using tweets to gauge pre-event messaging with messaging during and immediately after events, i.e., tornado.
I have not worked with them. I'm familiar with their work. We as communications scholars, we're working in very similar spaces, and so I really value the new approaches that they are taking to looking at how Twitter is being utilized. And my understanding of one of the things that they've done is they've looked at the volume of tweets that are coming out from the public during an event, and their relationship to those events themselves. I don't know if they've done the kind of experimental research that would typically be done to assess the effectiveness of different kinds of messages, but that kind of activity is being done in other labs to look at how the kinds of contents that messages that influence people to take behavioral action. I don't know if their lab is actually doing that kind of work, but I'm delighted to see that there are other scholars that are also working in this space, because it's a huge space and we all need to contribute together to help provide really actionable social science-driven information that you as practitioners can use, and that's our goal.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Dr. Sutton. We have one from Lance Rothfuse. John?
Sure. One of the notorious challenges with Twitter is warning operations is when old tweets are shared well after the event has ended. did you account for or remove information retweeted in the wrong event period?
Well, we haven't, because that was not part of the data set that we were looking at. I can imagine that we would find those kinds of tweets if we were collecting data on specific events longitudinally. Maybe if we collected on a hashtag, like, I don't know, Oklahoma tornado or something, and we collected for a 48-hour period, we would probably see that a wrong tweet pop up many times over and over again. And so in our research, we weren't looking at that kind of information because of the kind of data that we were coding. However, it is a problem that can be managed by including a timestamp in the tweet. It's one strategy. It's not perfect because some tweets do pick up a lot of steam and they get pushed on by a lot of people. And one of the reasons that people retweet things is because they see other people retweeting them. And so that's, part of being part of this ongoing conversation and being really present and monitoring what's going on is to continue to push more information out that's updated and that has a timestamp on it so that people can see this is the most recent, most relevant information and not what I saw 2 hours ago.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Sutton. Thanks, Lance, for the question. I wanted to get back to your initial slide about the goal, tactic, strategy. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that your study is out of scope about whether these tweets is actually changing behavior. But I mean, I think one of the questions we struggle with in this area is knowing what the baseline behavior is. So, Weather Service has been around for a long time. Social media has not been around for that long of a time. And people have been responding to our products and services in various manners. So changing behavior, first of all, we might assume that some of the behavior doesn't need to be changed. It is what we would hope for. But nonetheless, now social media is on here and we have another tool to get people to respond in the way we would like, or reinforce the good things that they're already doing. So, I mean, that obviously is, like I said, beyond the scope of this study, but how would you, at least in terms of Twitter, how would you hope to know whether behavior is being changed or modified?
Oh, the after action studies that are being done are going to be the really important indicator of whether or not people are actually taking the actions that protect them, and based upon what kind of input. The input being information that they get from their TV, from mainstream media, information they get from an app on their cell phone, information they get from social media where they're following lots of different individuals in addition to the National Weather Service, and then asking questions of those individuals about what actions did they take, at what point in time after they received the information and made their own assessment of the environment and the impacts that were occurring at the time. So it's survey research of the affected population to see what were the channels, the tactics, what were the messages, the strategies, what were the risk perceptions and the interpretations of the messages and of the environment around them that led them to the decisions that they made about the actions that they took. I say that it's more complex than the kind of research that I am presenting here because it actually requires going out and dealing with human beings on the ground. So it's challenging, it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's difficult, but it's absolutely necessary to get that kind of information in order to answer your question about what kinds of behaviors do people take following the receipt of these messages when they're under threat. And a lot of the really great research has been done by Mike Lindell, who does a lot of evacuation studies and evacuation modeling, and he includes the effect of messages that people have received as one of the variables that influence people's protective actions that they take. But it's a question that I wish that we could address for every event, but we can't. And so we glean from all of the different studies what we know has the greatest likelihood of making an impact. And I can tell you that we know a lot. We actually, if I was presenting a different study to you, I would be sharing with you all of the different characteristics of individual messages that increase the likelihood that people will take actions. But messages are just one little aspect of the overall information sphere and ecosystem where people are getting information from to make those decisions.
Right, and therein lies, the big challenge, and that I won't say struggling with, but we have before us in Weather Services as we embark on this grand IDSS strategy and paradigm shift, if you will, is the recognition that we don't own the whole picture. We barely own a tiny fraction of it, and what people do with the information and how it circles around, et cetera, is largely out of our control. So how do we interact with that information sphere in a way that's productive and not counterproductive, I guess, is what we need to be looking at, and how do we best influence things in the right direction, whatever that means.
Right. Yes. In so many ways, my understanding of the Weather Service, your hands are tied in many ways of the apps that you can build and the information that can be pushed out, and that and the partnering becomes incredibly important with industry and with media, and that means that the Weather Service is not the whole picture, like you said, but it certainly is part of the picture, especially as a trusted source of credible information. And so while you might not be the whole picture, you are a very important part of it that people really rely on for information. I give you just a very silly example of last night. I was in Chicago preparing to travel home today, and I got a message from the United Airlines, and it said, there's a potential for weather in your area. You might want to change your ticket, and we'll let you do that for free. They gave no information about what the potential for weather was, when, how, the likelihood, where I could get additional information. So we went directly to the National Weather Service to find information. Looked on different apps, looked through our information environment, but the Weather Service was where I really wanted to find that key decision-making information. I never did find what exactly the United Airlines was talking about. I think that they can improve on their risk communication, but the Weather Service was who I was relying on. I believe that a lot of people do the same.
Yeah. Okay, one last quick thing that to ask you. So I assume the tweet study that you've done here was focused on the Weather Service offices tweeting to what they would describe as the general public. They're not, but I'm sure you're aware that in our IDSS strategy, we're focused, our swim lane to really go beyond this kind of thing is with our so-called core partners. Are you aware of any Weather Service offices who are using like tweets that are directed to these specialized partners, or is it really the generic John Q. public kind of users?
I'm not aware of offices that are using smaller lists to communicate with partners. I'm very interested in looking at the way that NWS chat is used to facilitate that conversation with the integrated warning team partners. I think that's probably part of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
because that closed channel offers those organizations the opportunity to ask more detailed questions that may be more appropriate for that kind of a space for communication. One of the things that we saw as we've been looking at tweets over time is some offices seem to be talking to a very specialized group of people, and other offices seem to be talking to John Q. Public, like you mentioned. I can't recall why we had river forecast offices in our tweet data at one point, but we were looking at those river crust data, and it was very technical information that people generally would not understand what was being communicated, but it was being pushed out over Twitter. So in some cases, it may be that offices have an understanding of who they're communicating to, and they are only communicating to that one audience, because if the public can't understand what's being communicated, obviously it's going to be of value to them. But I don't know if there are offices that have that particular strategy that you asked about. It would be interesting to see how they're using that as a back channel on Twitter.
Right. Okay, very good. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Sutton, for, again, a very engaging talk, pardon the pun, and appreciate, your providing this to us, and I hope, you receive funding however you can to continue this work so that we can benefit in Weather Service from exactly the results of your studies, because I think it's really critical as we, again, go forward in this complex world of decision support. So thanks again. I want to, you're very welcome. And for our VLabForum listeners here, I want to remind, coming up in September, continuing in our sort of IDSS social science realm, we have Dr. Joe Ripberger, who's going to be talking about baseline measures of reception, comprehension, and response to severe weather warnings and forecasts, presenting. That will be VLabForum Talk number 99. And in October, we're going to be on our 100th edition of VLabForum. We're trying to book a special guest. We'll let you know if we succeed in that, but October will be our 100th edition, and so look forward to that. And reminder, you should get a notification when John has uploaded this talk to the VLabForum website. You can share with your colleagues, friends, and other folks. So thanks, everyone, and we're signing off.